Hello and welcome to We Are Human, the podcast where we aim to empower, educate and inspire you on the pro-life issue. Coming up in this month's podcast, we'll reflect on the incredible legacy of former Taoiseach John Bruton, who was also a wonderful pro-life advocate. John sadly died recently. Later on, I'll be giving you your courageous communication tip, and I'll be going beyond the headlines with Melissa Byrne, where we'll hear about the staggering increase in the numbers of abortions here in Ireland, and also a tragic story of a woman who lost her life after an abortion. But first, as always, it's time for Fantastic Facts. And this month it is all about the baby's development at just 11 weeks gestation, so 11 weeks old, and there is a lot of growth happening. One of the things that I love about this particular stage of development is hair follicles. They're starting to form on the baby's head and indeed all over the baby's body. Now, at this stage as well, the baby's tiny hands and feet have 10 little fingers and 10 little toes. Now, before this, they were kind of webbed, but now they're individual fingers and toes. And speaking of fingers and toes, the baby's toenails and toe beds are also developing. And over the next few weeks, those little nails will actually begin to grow. And fascinatingly, if it is a little girl, at just 11 weeks, the little girl's ovaries are starting to develop. Also, it feels like when you see pictures or images of babies at this stage of development, their human characteristics are really starting to take shape because they've got their hands and feet in front of their body, their ears are nearly in their final shape, and they even have visible nipples. Now, I know I was describing this, and as I'm saying it, I'm genuinely sure that many of you are going, they're such lovely facts. And it is. It's so incredible to think at just 11 weeks of these tiny hair follicles, these little nail beds. But it's also at this time here in Ireland that we have to remember that up to 12 weeks, a baby can have their life ended via abortion for any reason whatsoever. So it's up to us as a pro-life community to make sure we continue to educate people on the fantastic facts of the baby's development and also get people to join the dots on this reality, the incredible development that's happening on the one hand, while on the other hand, the barbarism of abortion that can happen for any reason up to 12 weeks. So that's this month's Fantastic Facts. We wanted to pay a special tribute to former Taoiseach John Bruton, who recently died at the age of 76. John was an incredible advocate for the pro-life movement. Indeed, during the referendum in 2018 here in Ireland, he publicly campaigned for a no vote. He was so distinguished. He was a very much respected statesman. He did a huge amount of work on the peace process in Northern Ireland as well. He really was a true man of integrity. And one of the things that when I reflected on John's life is that he displayed many qualities that are not often seen in political leaders today. And that really is unfortunate because he was admired across the political divide. He was a politician. He was a person. He didn't court limelight. He wasn't seeking popularity. He simply was a statesman that was truly focused on the common good. And I think that true focus on the common good and wanting the best for all of society is really emphasised in his pro-life views. Instead, he used his position to advocate passionately for those who he cared about, for people in general, and indeed for the unborn. Indeed, some of you watching may have been at the dinner or have seen him speaking at the Pro-Life Campaign's annual dinner that was in 2018. And certainly for me, having been there, it was one of those speeches that you simply never forget in terms of his advocacy and his passion for the unborn and for the pro-life movement. So we wanted to show you a little bit of the speech that John Bruton made at the Pro-Life Campaign's national dinner in 2018.
I know everybody here feels a deep sense of disappointment at the decision that the Irish people took. But the arguments that we advanced during the campaign were valid then and they are valid now. They were philosophically coherent and expressed a well thought out value system that protects the weak and the voiceless. It's a value system that's based on respect for humanity and human life, and on the dignity and equality of all human life. Indeed, it could be said that the Irish media, and indeed perhaps the Irish people, are like starlings. They're all going in one direction at one time, and then eventually This is the hopeful part. They turn and they start going the other direction. So, think of the starlings, don't lose hope. Lighting the way forward, the real route to a brighter Ireland. Thank you.
Well, I think you'll all agree, having seen and heard a little bit of John Bruton's address to the pro-life movement in 2018. He truly was an incredible pro-life advocate, a true statesman, a noble statesman. He will be sadly missed, and our prayers are with him and with all of his family. So I'm joined now by Melissa Byrne, and we're going to be going beyond the headlines, bringing you the stories that are often underreported or not reported at all. And this next story definitely falls into that category because we saw nothing about it here in the Irish media. And this is a really tragic story. It's about a woman who died after having an abortion. Melissa, tell us a bit more about the story.
Yeah, so this was a young mother of two, Harjeet, over in Australia, and basically she had decided to go. She has two children, and she found out she was pregnant with her third, and she decided to have an abortion. She opted for a surgical abortion and tragically died as a result of that procedure. It's a very, very heartbreaking story because you can see how it's the same thing there. I think in one of the stories there, her husband had spoken about how, they had been told that the procedure was perfectly safe, which of course we always know that abortion isn't safe because it's always ending the life of an unborn child. And in this scenario, really tragically, we also saw the end of the life of poor Harjeet. So it was a really, really tragic story. And like you said, not one that we're actually really seeing brought to light, sadly. I feel like there should be more of an opportunity for people to sort of memorialize this woman and sort of, acknowledge the sort of grief that is now there for her husband and for her two children.
One of the things I can't help but think is that, and sadly this hasn't been the first story over the last number of years where women have died in different circumstances in so-called safe abortion procedures, that whether, you call yourself pro-life, you're pro-choice, or if you are a campaigner for women's rights, surely it would be important to highlight this story and to talk about it. And, we saw here in Ireland that the tragic story of Savita Halappanavar, which was conflated with abortion, she died of sepsis. Several reports show that this is what happened in her case, but her story was used to push abortion. The headlines around the world, it was like woman who was denied abortion was died. Yet when we have a situation where a woman died after an abortion, there's no attention paid to it to just highlight that this does happen and that it is a tragedy.
Yeah, and I mean, we see kind of two things happening there. Where one, like you said, we don't acknowledge, I think in the same sort of category almost as with kind of abortion regret, we don't really acknowledge those stories that don't necessarily fit into a very affirming attitude towards abortion. As well as that, another thing we don't really see is that even these comments that, the husband has been saying that, they were told the procedure was completely safe is in all aspects of healthcare, when someone has to undergo a procedure, there's always that risk, particularly with something like surgical abortion is always the risk of, for example, like infection. And yet we kind of constantly hear this affirmation, or it's sort of reasserting that abortion is completely safe, there are no side effects, and that's kind of what we hear, and there's not really much dissent from that. So like you said, if we want to actually offer women comprehensive and proper healthcare, we should be informing them of all of the aspects to do with abortion and not just trying to have it from a very sort of one-sided perspective.
And that's the thing that I can't help but think when I am reflecting on our next story, is the fact that the information that's more than likely given to many women is this kind of one-sided, all roads lead to abortion. There has to be a contributing factor there when we look at the latest figures in terms of Ireland. 2023, it looked like, in response to a parliamentary question asked by Deputy Carol Nolan, where they basically looked at the numbers of doctors that were making claims, because they have to obviously claim to get paid for their abortion provision. It was over 9,000 abortions, 9,218. So they're just abortions that took place through GP services. So that's not taking into account abortions at different stages or that were carried out in hospitals. So tragically, it looks like 10,000 abortions took place in 2023. This is about a 200% increase from the kind of rates of abortions we would have seen pre-legislation, but nobody's talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. It's not really something that I think a lot of people, especially in government, really want to know about, because it's just this idea that, well, abortion has come in and we're not really going to make any attempts to sort of address why the abortion rates are rising at such a dramatic rate. It's one of those things as well that we're looking at and we're saying, well, hang on a second. In the lead up to the Eighth Amendment, it was all about how abortion was going to be this rare sort of provision within healthcare. As we know, it's not healthcare, but that was the sort of reassurance that people were given that this is going to be a rare
Yeah, and
thing.
you know what, Melissa,
And
even further than that, I'm sure you had this experience on campus, but myself and others who were kind of doing media interviews, anytime we would say this is going to greatly increase the number of abortions that will happen, you were kind of fobbed off as scaremongering, and it was just kind of ignored. And the very kind of ministers, etc., that were saying this isn't going to happen, the rate isn't going to change, they're nowhere to be seen now.
absolutely. And I mean, I think the thing that stands out for me is, I think Carol Nolan had said it, that we are essentially betraying women. Like, that's what this abortion service is doing. It's betraying women. We're saying to them, there's no other options for you. There's no other sort of road that you can take. The best thing that you can do is opt for an abortion. And it's that kind of thing that we see where are the positive alternatives? Where is the government stepping in? Leo Varadkar said that he was concerned with the rise in numbers, and yet there hasn't really been anything done to address it. And so I'm really concerned about the loss of lives, and also the women who now have to kind of deal with a society and a culture in which abortion is becoming more and more normalized.
Yeah, I think it was very well put when Carol Nolan called it an epidemic of loss, because it is such a loss of life and in such a short space of time, just to see such an exponential increase. And it's very troubling that there's been no effort. There's going to be no conversation had. Okay, well, what's the root causes? What's the why behind this? Or even the flip side of that is, let's talk to the thousands of women that went for that first appointment, continued with their pregnancy. What did they find? What resource? What person? What was it? And can we do more of that to help women to choose life?
Absolutely.
I wanted to move on to another story now, Melissa, which is very relevant because I know you do a lot of work with Students for Life. And this is in relation to the University of Manchester. And basically, they have starting a pro life society there, and a petition was done to say this shouldn't be allowed to happen. What do you make of it? Tell us more about the story.
Yeah, I mean, this story really, like, I'm reading through it, and it's one of those things where you almost kind of have to stop yourself a little bit from laughing in sort of disbelief, because there's a real, basically, there's been a kind of a student petition put forth that essentially is that this pro-life society, within Manchester University, is sort of contributing to sort of an attitude of oppression in the sense of bodily autonomy. What I really enjoyed about one of the news articles discussing it is a girl who had been sort of campaigning against the society was saying that she thought that it was almost like a Margaret Atwood novel. I know a lot of people are probably familiar with like The Handmaid's Tale, and for me it stands out as, we can't just have an environment in which you can sort of cry dystopia anytime someone or a position comes up that you disagree with, or you're presented with an argument that doesn't mesh with your own viewpoint. And we see it on the opposite side too, where people constantly talk about things being really Orwellian. And it's like, you're not living in a dystopian universe because there's people that disagree and have a different perspective to you. And I know as well it is relevant to universities here, because we should be calling, there was a great Professor Ian Kerr who talks about Newman, and he basically had this idea that we need to have like dispassionate minds. We need to be actually searching for what is true, and that we need to be able to argue and discuss other viewpoints that we don't necessarily agree with. And I think that's so important within the context of university. We need to be able to have students engage with one another on topics that they disagree with. Um, I know in my own university
Yes,
experience,
isn't
I studied.
that is one of the big parts of college life. It's that kind of intellectual curiosity. It's that ability to be able to debate, to communicate civilly, and to allow the kind of room and space for ideas to be thrashed out in a respectful way.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very sort of like I was saying, like when I was in college, I studied a lot of people like Audre Lorde Bell Hooks, Judith Butler, like sort of theorists that I didn't necessarily agree with, but uh, actually be having the opportunity to study them and engage with their work, you can find those areas of agreement and also understand your own argument better, and how you can sort of sharpen your position and kind of learn from that as well. I think we shouldn't be promoting an attitude within universities that if you approach or find an argument that you disagree with, that you should kind of shut yourself off from that. We need to foster a sort of curious attitude to learning. And we can see it here with this trying to shut down the pro-life society. And I think as well that the society here has put forward, they said we're also concerned about poverty, we're concerned about the death penalty, assisted suicide, climate change. And I would be willing to bet that there's probably students within that society who could find areas of agreement with people who are maybe advocating against the society existing.
Yeah, it's a worrying trend that's been happening on campuses in the UK, and I know there's, as you talked about here in Ireland, there's been some experience of it too, and I think we do have to make sure that we stand up for authentic free speech, not just in campuses but everywhere. I wanted to show you guys now just a clip from the March for Life, which happens in January in the United States. So this is thousands of people from all across the United States come together to March for Life, and this is just one clip that caught my attention, where this woman is just sharing a little bit of her experience of why she was marching.
I march for my 4 siblings because there is no grave. There's nowhere to lay flowers. They have no names, there are no birth dates, and there are no death dates. When I was in my early 20s, my dad, he'd revealed that he'd had 2 girlfriends who'd had abortions before he met my mom. We'd had this conversation around pro-life and abortion and all these things. He told me that my mother had aborted the baby that came before me. She wasn't ready. And then I think about 3 to 6 months after I'd been born, she got pregnant again, and she didn't want to go through pregnancy a second time. She just didn't care for it. It really changed my perspective because I was raised pro-choice, pro-abortion. And I thought about the arguments. I was like, I don't think I can stand for this anymore. I can't do this, because the more I thought about the reasons that they gave, it's your mother's choice, and I didn't want to go through this, and I didn't feel like this. The more I thought, well, the reason why I was had is more that I was the more conveniently timed one. Over time, I became very pro-life, but I marched for my 4 siblings.
So I just felt when I was watching that woman's story, because everybody has a story, it is that theme, why we march. It's something that we probably don't reflect on enough. Is, we often think maybe of the woman who has, abortion regret. But here's this woman talking about the siblings that she lost. And I guess it's just another area that it shows us the ripple effect of abortion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that woman was a very powerful sort of, it was very powerful to hear her speak. And I think that the one thing that occurs to me is we don't often think of sort of, like you said, that kind of complexity of grief, where, of course, we rightfully do focus on sort of the mother involved in abortion, and then also maybe her partner or spouse and how it affects them. But there is that kind of disconnect when we don't really think of how it sort of affects other family members, and particularly in that context, siblings. I know my mom miscarried when I was younger, and it had a very sort of lasting impact on me, absolutely, 100%. And it's something that I would still think about, to know that you had a sibling who died, and to sort of it's something we don't often see in the conversation surrounding abortion, where, well, how does this affect sort of the parents, but how does it affect other people who are connected and related to that child?
Yeah, it's the ripple effect. It's the communities that are affected. It's here in Ireland. I mean, earlier we were talking about the numbers of abortions, 10,000. That's literally children missing from every school, every preschool classroom in the country, and that is the ripple effect. I just wanted to finish now with one last story, which is in relation to assisted suicide. So here in Ireland, the Oireachtas Committee, so our Parliament, has been having these committees discussing the issue of assisted suicide. They had their last sittings recently, and there's been many people contributing, a lot of doctors, a lot of psychiatrists, different medics, people talking about the experiences of other countries. So take a listen to Dr. Siobhan Nivrian. This was her opening statement, and I think it had some really interesting points.
We as clinicians believe that clinicians should be able to discuss death, dying and end-of-life care in a sensitive and non-judgmental way. Conscientious objection should be enabled as part of any legislation. You will have heard from Dr. Anne Doherty in November of 2023, who described treating people with cancer who have suicidal thoughts. Dr. Doherty expressed concerns about how robustly such people would be investigated and treated for a potential mental illness if there was legislation on assisted dying. And these are concerns that we share and would apply to other areas of clinical practice, including the diagnosis of other potentially life-limiting conditions, including neurological disorders, certain respiratory diseases, and many others. This in turn leads us to the issue of patient safety. There is a risk that a person may make a decision to seek assistance with dying when, in fact, more robust investigation or time to consider the diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment options may result in them opting for another or different approach to care. On foot of that, we considered that robust and commensurate safeguarding issues, drawing on citizen perspectives and research evidence, would need to be in place to support any person who's considering this route. International evidence in other jurisdictions does suggest that where legislation has been introduced, safeguards do change over time to include lower age thresholds, for example, in the Netherlands, and expansion of the eligibility criteria. These are some of the issues that need to be considered when looking at the introduction of legislation to support assisted dying. The theme for today's meeting is examining a system for assisted dying. It is the conclusion of the senior clinical group in the HSE that there are significant supports, both legal and medical, in Ireland to enable people to die in a dignified way. The importance of will and preference is now enshrined in law. People do have a right to refuse life-sustaining treatment, and there is access nationally to palliative care services. The draft palliative care policy will further enhance and embed palliative care across the spectrum of healthcare provision in Ireland. Also of note, there are legal protections in place in other areas of clinical care, such as the Mental Health Act. This concludes our opening statement, and my colleagues and I will endeavour to answer any of your questions.
So, hearing Dr. Navreen speak and just talking about how she's echoing some of the concerns that others have had. I've watched all of the committee hearings and read all of the transcripts, and that seems to be one of the big issues is how can you possibly define, what is the driving force for this desire to, want to end your life prematurely? Is it outside pressure? Is there, mental illness in conjunction with maybe a physical illness? And also just the experience of other countries. What have you made of some of the discussions, Melissa?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said there, even about the experience of other countries, like it's listening to her talk there, it does give a lot of food for thought, especially when she talks about how, in other jurisdictions, we do see sort of an expansion of eligibility. So people who weren't previously eligible for assisted suicide, as time goes on, those people then move into categories where they do in fact become eligible or can avail of assisted suicide. And I think the main thing that I've taken away from all of these discussions is that we're always kind of focused. There's a lot of discussion in this country about how we can kind of progress, how we can focus on human rights. And we do a lot of good work in that area. But what we're really missing here is that we're essentially saying that it's perfectly fine to devalue the lives of certain people, and in these discussions, it's particularly centered on people who have terminal illness, disability, and potentially older, vulnerable people, maybe with chronic illness. It's really, really upsetting, to be honest, because I was saying this to one of my friends recently, and I was like, if I expressed to you that I had a desire to die, I would hope that your first response would be, how can I help you with that? What support can we get you? And I guarantee you that your mindset would be completely focused on, I want to make sure that this person has all the support they need so they do not make that irreversible decision to end their lives. And in the context of assisted dying, however, would it be different if I had a terminal illness or a chronic illness? Would people then say to me, well, actually, okay, if you feel a desire to die, then, we're going to honor your wishes, because essentially we don't really see the value in your life in comparison to what we consider a sort of normal or healthy person.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I know a palliative care specialist made at one of the hearings, saying if this is legalised in Ireland, it doesn't become the decision you have to make the decision to not die by suicide if you're terminally ill, because here it is placed in front of you, this is one of your options. And I thought what was very interesting in that last doctor's piece was saying, hang on, look at all the services that we have in this country, and just that idea we should be striving to improve these services and make them better and assisting people to live, not assisting them to die.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, we could even see, I think it was, she mentions in the video, I think Professor Doherty, who gave a really, her sort of testimony on sort of dealing with people who have mental health issues or depression, and how it can be difficult to sort of distinguish between, what is actually linked to this person's illness and what is actually linked to the fact that they are sort of struggling and maybe experiencing depression. And is there the possibility for us to be able to actually treat and support people going through or who have depression, and acknowledge that that might actually and is a separate thing from them being ill?
Yeah, well, Melissa, as always, thanks so much for joining us on this month's Beyond the Headlines.
Thanks so much, Wendy.
And now it's time for this month's Courageous Communication Tip. So this is the part of the podcast where I try to help you communicate as best you can on the pro-life issue. And this month, it's all about thinking of the other person. So often we're so passionate about this topic that we kind of head into autopilot almost. And we think, okay, I have to get across all the great pro-life information or a story that I want to tell. And in doing that, we're kind of blinkered. And we probably put our earphones in as well. We might be actually paying attention to the other person. But two really important elements of communication: the best communicators, rather than thinking of themselves, they're actually thinking of the other person, listening to the other person's point of view, listening to where the other person is coming from, trying to ask follow-up questions, and not just kind of, I'm going through the motion asking these questions because I want to appear interested. It's being genuinely interested in the person's point of view. Now, I know that this can be difficult, especially at times when you're discussing such an emotive topic, but there's ways that you can do it. It's asking the follow-up questions or asking them to clarify the points that they just made, or simple follow-ups like, explain more what you feel about that, or I've never heard it put that way before. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? Again, it's a genuine interest that you have to show in the other person and their point of view. And the impact of this is that the more interest that you show, the more they'll hopefully show to you and actively listen to you. And it really opens up the lines of communication. So that's this month's Courageous Communication Tip. That's all we've got time for on this month's We Are Human podcast. I've been your host, Wendy Grace, and this podcast is brought to you by the Pro Life Campaign in Ireland. For more information on much of what we've talked on, how you can get involved and indeed support the work of the Pro Life Campaign, you can go to their website, which is prolifecampiagn.ie. It would be fantastic if you could subscribe to the podcast and like, and sure, leave us a review if you can as well. We'll talk to you next month.